Anyway, here we are this morning, and we're live streaming with this modern technology, and amazingly, we're able to take this message to basically the four corners of the world. I've come up with some statistics in a moment, but I just find it quite amazing and very, very strange. Now, I wonder how many of you have been confronted with this sight when they've gone into their local Coles or Woolworths. I've seen it many, many times, and I'm assuming you can see this image on the screen. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, so they're caught up with me. Okay, so if you've seen this scene, I'm sure most of us have been confronted by it. But something happened just yesterday. I was up in our local Coles, and something happened quite different. I came in and I was expecting to, in the toilet roll section, to come up with an empty aisle. But amazingly, it was actually completely full, but not of toilet tissue. It was full of Easter eggs. The whole toilet roll section was filled with Easter eggs. And I had to speak to one of the staff there to find out what in the world was going on. We live in a very, very strange world when we can't buy toilet tissue, but there's just acres and acres of chocolate Easter eggs for all to go around. So this actually brings me to my topic for today. We live in a very strange world in very strange times, and we are going to be confronted with choices we will have to make that will determine our well-being into our future here in this world and ultimately our eternal destiny. So I want to just launch into my topic for today. It's called Country Living. Is it time or is it too late? My wife Susan and myself in December 2017, after quite an extensive search, purchased a small country property in a little village called Kalungaluk, just a short drive away from Foster on the mid-north coast. And so December 2017, we purchased that property. We'd searched far and wide. We'd looked down as far south as Tumut in the Southern Highlands, or beyond the Southern Highlands, down toward the Snowy Mountains. We looked up north, up at Gyra in the northern tablelands. We looked down the south coast at Gerringong and Jarrowa. We looked up at Fountaindale and Gillaby in the central coast area of New South Wales. We looked at a little place called Murray's Run, west of the central coast, out there in a very rather isolated and remote district we both really loved. But ultimately we settled on a property up at Kalungaluk, which is about 300 kilometres north of here. We felt at the time very much convicted that this was the decision we needed to make, given our circumstances, in a medium-term kind of pattern, kind of thinking. And so we did that, and we had a plan. We had a long-term plan or a medium-term plan to develop that property, to grow orchard trees, fruits and nut trees, to grow bushes for berries, to have vegetable gardens, of course, and chickens and honeybees. And so we had quite an extensive plan that we wanted to implement up there. But I don't mean to be unkind to my wife, but she got cold feet. My wife was born and raised in Seoul in South Korea, and she's come to Australia and lived in Sydney the rest of her life, so she's never really lived outside of the city. And for her it became a little bit overwhelming, the idea of these snakes and the ticks and all the various challenges of living out in the bush, so to speak. I can see Brad here laughing because he's a bit more like me, I think. He'd love to be out there in the country getting dirt between his fingers. But so we made that decision, and now 2.5 years have passed, and we're living in these very strange and uncertain times, and we've come to the place where we think it may be time to make the next step. You know, it was always an interim step. It would either be Kalungaluk and a nursing home, or Kalungaluk, or further into the country. We weren't sure what was going to happen, how the timing might work out. And so we believe now that it may be time to make a next step. And so my wife loves to search the real estate market, and she's come across a property, well, it's an unusual village called Number One, Numberone, Number One. quite an unusual name for a township or a village or a district. There is no township, there's no shops, there's no post office, there's no nothing. Anyway, it's somewhat more remote than where we currently are, but I'll come back to that in a moment as to what that means. But it's about an hour and a half further away from Kalungaluk, so it's about 4.5 hours from here. And it's got some pros and some cons. Now, for example, in its favour, in the positive aspect of looking at this new property, it's a larger piece of land, from 3 acres up to 21 acres. So quite a substantially larger piece of land. No go looking for it there, please, Brad. This is a secret hideout we want to get to. Another positive thing about this property is there's better quality soil. Of course, soil quality is very paramount if you're going to go into some kind of self-sufficiency. And so this is another positive thing we found about this particular area. And the third important thing we found there is that it has permanent water. It has 2 boundaries with water, so a creek on one side, a river on the other side, and then a fence on one side and a roadway on the other side. So plenty of permanent water. It said it's good for fishing, good for canoeing, good for watering the stock. So, and it's a permanent water supply in the river out there. So we're very comfortable with that issue. So there's some of the positive things we like about this place. On the negative side, there's always some things you need to be realistic and evaluate before you launch out into making decisions like this. The first thing is it's remote. Just like, that's a positive thing, it's remote. We like that. But on the negative side, it's also remote. And that can be bad. It can keep, it adds expenses for providing services, for going and doing your shopping, visiting people, for visiting people to visit you. It's not always good when you're remote, and you have to take this into account if you are considering going into some country living kind of lifestyle. Secondly, the cost. To be able to do this, it will require us to sell our Sydney home, and you cannot make decisions like that lightly. We were fortunate when we bought the other property, we could do so without having to completely abandon our Sydney base. My wife has a functioning business at the moment, and we have our home, we have a daughter living with us, and to make the decision to sell that Sydney home here in Kellyville and to go to the country like that is a major decision we will have to contemplate very, very carefully. Financial costs, I've heard it said that once you sell out of the Sydney market, you'll never be able to get back in again, and that would probably be true of us. So the cost. A third important factor, or a fourth important factor, is phone reception is virtually non-existent out there. So you need to work around that, whether you can go a satellite phone or the fixed wireless broadband that I currently have at Kalungaluk. We need to explore what's that going to be like for us. Is a landline phone going to be sufficient? We're so, dependent upon our phone devices these days, aren't we? A lot of the people today watching on Zoom, by the way, there's no people on the screen in front of me here. A lot of those could be using their phone devices and tablets and so forth. So we have been carefully weighing up the pros and the cons of going to buy this parcel of land. We've also contemplated selling the existing land and coming back to Sydney. The business at the moment with the coronavirus is under threat. I mean, that's all I can say at this stage. We don't know. It's very uncertain. It's our only source of income. We're just not certain yet how that might hold up, given the potential longevity of this crisis that we're going through. So what we want to do for the remainder of our time today is to explore what the Bible has to say regarding these strange times in which we live. I think I heard Brad or Jomo this morning in Sabbath school quote Amos 3:7, where it says, "Surely the Lord God does nothing unless he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets." And so if we want to find out about the circumstances in which we are confronted with today in our modern world, we need to go to God's word. God has revealed to us the circumstances we are living in. He knows the end from the beginning. Nothing is hidden from God. And so we can safely turn to God's word and find there information that will help us make decisions about what we ought to be doing with our lives today. Is country living something that God might be interested in us or concerned for us to be involved with? Ought we be just busy about our normal lives and not being concerned about doing something like that? And so the Bible is available here for us to be able to pick up, to read and discover what God is telling us about the circumstances in which we live. Now, before we just open the Bible, though, I want to just come back to this word strange. I used at the very beginning. We live in very strange times. And I don't know why I chose that word initially, but it was just a word that came to mind. But I looked up the dictionary definition, and it says this. It says, unusual or surprising, difficult to understand or explain. I thought, wow, that really does describe what we're going through at the moment. It's hard to explain the actual experience of what we're going through. And it says slightly or undefinably unwell or ill at ease. And I believe that people, not only here in Windsor Church family, but throughout Sydney and throughout Australia and throughout most of the world, people are feeling ill at ease with what's going on. Pastor Terry's message this morning is encouraging us to cherish hope, to don't give in to despair. And all this is good and well. But the reality is, there is this sense of ill at ease in the world today. There's this uncertainty. We don't know where it's going to go next. And I think for myself, personally, my wife and I, discussing these things, she said to me the other day, she realises just how quickly things can change. In just almost overnight, within a few days, our basic freedoms to move about and to go as we come and go as we please have been taken away from us. And I would like to suggest for good reason. I'm not going to beat a political drum here, but all I can say is that the times we're living in call for pretty desperate measures. And so that's what we see happening. And it makes us realise that things will not continue on as they have done. You know, we live in a very favoured generation of people who have never really been confronted by terrible hardship. In my lifetime, not so brief, I can remember the 2008 global financial crisis comes to mind. I can remember the stock market crash of the 1986-87, I think it was. I can remember some of those various other viruses that have come and gone, the swine flu and the SARS, and these things have come and gone, but they've hardly caused a blip, really, in our lifestyle or the way we go about our lives. They've hardly affected us at all here in Australia. I was a youngster during the time of the Vietnam War. My elder brothers, both, or two of them, missed out on being called up very closely. And so, yeah, those sort of things are, I guess, the things that come to mind in my lifetime where there've been potential crisis or challenge. The other thing that comes to mind is that tsunami in 2004, I think it was. And of course, the 2001 World Trade Center attack. They're life-changing events. But even those things pale into insignificance compared to what we're actually going through now. So we're living in unusual, strange times. So let's go to our Bibles then and see what God has to say to us about the times we're living in. And Matthew 24 is the place to begin a topic of this nature. And we'll just introduce it by the question that's asked at the very beginning there of chapter 24. So Jesus and his disciples go out from the temple. They go across to the other side of the valley to the Mount of Olives, I understand. I think that's correct, isn't it, Dwayne? And they had a very good view of the city and especially of the temple in front of them. And Jesus said, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So, for the disciples, they equated the destruction of the temple with the return of Jesus and the coming of the eternal age. That there was no real separation in their thinking. The temple was so paramount for their way of life, their whole worship system. For the destruction of the temple to take place for them would be the end of an era and the commencement of God's eternal reign. And so they asked Jesus to tell him when these things were going to be taking place. And then Jesus, I was going to say rattled off, but that's not a correct way of putting it, but he elaborated on some of the things that we might expect to see, both in their context, before the destruction of the physical temple was to happen, and also in the context of the last days and the coming of Jesus and the establishment of his kingdom. So Jesus said, I will give you a list of these things that you will expect to see. And he went on to talk about false Christs, false prophets, wars, rumours of wars, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, persecution, many being offended. And that is people, believers who become offended by what's going on and they depart. They call it apostasy in the Greek language. And so people becoming offended about being Christians, being persecuted, facing all these trials, and they actually depart from the faith. We see that. Love growing cold, and then finally the gospel going to all the world. They're the signs that Jesus elaborated on in this chapter of what would be expected to take place both in the lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem, that's for the disciples there in their lifetime, and also in the context of the end of the world and the coming of Jesus. And of course, we want to apply the important lessons from this passage to what we're experiencing in our world today and what we might expect in the not too distant future. So I want to just pause though and just think for a moment about that verse in verse 14. The last comment there that he made was that this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. Now, all the other signs, if you like, that he gave have already been fulfilled to some degree or another, both in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem and also in the context of our end time scenario, except perhaps persecution. In my lifetime, I've never seen persecution in terms of our religious faith, certainly not in Australia. In other parts of the world, yes, it does take place. Christians are persecuted and people of other faiths are persecuted. So that is a reality, and I would like to suggest, though, that what we haven't experienced really is persecution, and that's something we will yet be confronted with. So just on the last point, though, this idea that the gospel will be taken to all the world, I did a little bit of background on this on the Google search, and I discovered that 48% of the world's population have access to the internet. Say 50%, half of the world's population have access to the internet, and that was in 2017. Now here we are 2-3 years later, that could only have been enhanced, I would suspect. Now, out of that 50% of the world's population having access, is that take into account that children may not? Elderly people, I mean people older than me, not all, I mean there are many who do access modern technology, but there are those who just won't have a bar of it. And when you think over another half of a generation, 20 years from now, it will be so readily available pretty well to anywhere in the world. Now, of course, you have to take into account the developing world has less access than we do in the developed world. But nonetheless, when you take into account 50% of the world have access to the internet, you take into account Adventist World Radio and the work that it does, beaming its messages into places that are completely unentered. You know, all they need is a shortwave radio or other different forms of radio receiver, and their message can be received pretty well from anywhere in the world. Then you've got the whole thing of TV. You know, TV is an old school kind of phenomenon nowadays, and yet it's vastly widespread throughout the world. I lived in the Republic of Kiribati, up in the Central Pacific Ocean, and TV was available out there in the middle of nowhere. You think, wow. You know, satellites make this kind of technology readily available anywhere in the world. You got the God pods. Remember back a few years when they became all the rage? Taken to places in Africa and South America, into the Pacific Islands, into Southeast Asia, places where they could receive the word of God in their own language, with their own device, solar chargeable, It was almost like a foolproof idea. And these things are being used still today to take the gospel to all the world. Then you've got Adventist Mission, you've got the Bible Society, you've got Adventist emphasis on health evangelism and education. You know, we are so far ahead of, not ahead of, but ahead with doing this work that God has given to us in taking the gospel to the world. It makes my head spin that how close, because when the verse says there, and then the end will come. Once the gospel has been taken to all the world, then the end will come. That's how close we are. So let's move on to our next point from the next verse that talks about this obscure reference to the abomination of desolation. Verse 15. Now notice the very first word. It says, in my translation at least, it says, therefore. Right? Therefore is a connecting word, connecting this verse we're about to read with what we've just been reading. So therefore, you audience listening now, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, when you see that abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So we want to try and get the best interpretation we can of how this passage applies to us today. Now let's do that by, first of all, highlighting what it meant for them back there. The abomination of desolation for the disciples of Jesus, listening to this sermon or listening to this conversation, was that the Romans came in AD 70, they besieged the city of Jerusalem, and ultimately they completely destroyed, with over 1 million people being killed and about 100,000 people being taken captive. But those Christians who heeded the warning of Jesus were able to flee to the mountains, just as he had cautioned them to do. And so for them, the abomination of desolation was this pagan power coming into their city, defiling their worship centre, their temple, by putting up pagan idols, whether they be flags or animals or whatever other symbols they used to show their dominance. They had overthrown the people and the religion of the Jews of the time, and this was what was considered to be the abomination of desolation in that time. I think that's just a summarised idea of what that meant for them. Now, the question is then, what does it mean for us? What is the sign of when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place mean for us today? Well, I believe that the answer to that question is found in largely the book of Revelation in chapter 13. Now, there's a number of other places I'll refer to here, but primarily I want to turn to Revelation 13 and just touch briefly on what I think we should understand the abomination of desolation to mean for us in these modern, strange times. Revelation 13 verse 1, and there's just going to be a few words I want to highlight, and then I'll come back and comment. Notice verse 1. John sees a beast coming out of the sea. It has all these descriptions of 7 hordes and 10 hordes and all the crowns. And it says, on his heads, a blasphemous name. All right, so just keep in mind this point, that this beast power that John is seeing has a blasphemous name. Now notice verse 5 and verse 6. Verse 5, and he, speaking of this same beast power, it says he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. He was given authority to continue for 42 months. Verse 6, then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. Notice verses 11 and 12. We see a second beast power coming onto the scene. Verse 11, then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes or forces the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast. We have compulsion. We have force being exercised here against God's people. And verse 12 and verses 15 to 17. And he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause or force as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. These indications in these various verses, I believe, tell us what the abomination of desolation is for us. It is the exercise of blasphemy against God, the profaning of God's name, the claiming or the taking of the prerogatives of God alone to forgive sins, for example, and the idea of being forced to do what they want, to worship these images that they're going to create. They're going to cause people to receive a mark in their hand or their head. They're going to be forced to be killed if they refuse to comply. This, I believe, is the abomination of desolation in our end time context. When we see these things happening, it's time to flee. That's the message in Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, so we see blasphemous claims being made by this power. We see force being exercised by these twin powers at the end of time to force people, to compel people to do as they wish. And that will be, of course, compelling them to go against their conscience in their worship of God. Now come back with me to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we'll see just another brief introduction to this power, this abominating or desolating power. 2 Thessalonians 2 verses 3 and 4, just a brief insight. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. This is the abomination of desolation in the end time setting. Before Jesus comes, we're warned that these are the sort of things we should expect to see. And when we see these things taking place, it's time, according to what Jesus says, to flee to the mountains. Now, there's other passages we could look at, Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8, but for our purpose, I think I've made my point that we can clearly identify from the Bible what the abomination of desolation is and what it means for us in our modern day setting. That's crucial to what we're talking about here today. The signs that Jesus foretold in Matthew 24 have or largely have been fulfilled in the end time setting. Now, we're not talking about some of the detail, there's still obviously more to come. But the question is, this is the point I want to make. Jesus advises or cautions, or it's actually an imperative, you could read it as a command. When you see these things happen, what? Flee. Flee. Now, flee, to me, has a connotation of making haste. Flee has a very interesting connotation just in its actual word. But the idea is that we're called upon to escape what is taking place in the world at that time, to flee to the mountains, to escape to the mountains. Now, I've heard it said, and I remember this, I think it was mentioned by Dr. Norm Young in my Avondale days, that it's considered very undignified for an old man to be seen running. And I saw him running one day across the campus at Avondale, and it did look very undignified, I must say. And I don't know what it sort of looks like when people look at me, but it certainly feels undignified when you're an old man and running. In fact, I remember in my first year of ministry, I was working down at Campbelltown, and I was doing some chaplaincy at the primary school down there at MacArthur. And we were playing soccer with the kids during morning, being recess or lunchtime. And I heard this young boy, just a primary school, probably about 9 or 10-year-old boy, I heard him say to one of his mates, "That pastor runs like a girl." And that's what I said to myself this morning as I was thinking about this. I thought, wow, that was almost 20 years ago. And I wonder what I look like now. Certainly undignified. And so for me, For me, it probably looks something like this. I don't know if you can see this. It probably looks a bit like that. But for me, the thing is we need to do is to start early. Don't wait till the last possible moment before we flee. It may be too late, and it may be undignified to fleeing in that way. And when I mean undignified, I don't mean in the sense of wounding our pride, but I mean in the sense of it'll be a very chaotic escape from the cities by many people at the end of time, I believe. And that will mean losing households, losing lifetimes of built-up relationships and property and careers. And it's going to be an undignified exodus out of the cities to places of safety. Now, my earnest concern is that we don't leave it to that undignified time when it'll be just completely chaotic, and it'll be people stamping over the top of one another to get to where they want to go. You know, this toilet tissue joke, it's just so bizarre. You know, I have a neighbour up at home there, and he said one of his friends has collected 500 rolls of toilet tissue. One person, one family. And you think, well, what are other people doing? I mean, and what if, I think someone mentioned this morning, what if this is going to happen with our food, our basic food supplies, where you turn up at the supermarket just expecting to be able to buy a loaf of bread and a pint of milk, and guess what? It's just not there. And you've been caught, you know, out. And so, now I'm not predicting that is going to happen. It may at some point. But my point is this, you know, to do what Jesus commanded there, when we see certain things taking place, the counsel is to flee, isn't it? The Christians of Jesus' time, they paid heed to what they were told, and at the very opportune moment they fled and they escaped to freedom. Tradition says not one lost their life. And so for us, you know, are we going to be so tuned in to, well, not only what's going on, I mean, it's not prophecy interpretation by news media, but we need to be tuned into what God has told us will happen, believe it to be so, and act accordingly. It's all very well to stand and talk about it. It's all very well to, yes, one day I'll be doing that. The challenge is to actually put into action the things that we already know that God has forewarned us of. So I want to just wrap up by asking this question. Why consider country living now? And these are just 5 or 6 brief points that I'd like you to think about. Firstly, the signs we've talked about, and there's plenty of other biblical evidence we could refer to, and we could go into the spirit of prophecy and we would find an enormous amount of material that would remind us of the same thing. Time is running out. The signs of the times we live in highlight that reality. And this current crisis we're going through, for many, is a pretty stark wake-up call that things can change absolutely overnight. And we could be seriously in trouble without access to anything. I mean, there's talk of putting a $10,000 limit on cash transactions. I mean, that's only one step away from having a cashless society. And then they've got complete control over all buying and selling. That could happen almost overnight. You know, using emergency powers, martial law, these sorts of things, they can do whatever they like. And so time is running out, and I think we need to be taking seriously what are we going to do about it. Secondly, country living offers a healthier, more natural quality of life. You know, I'm speaking from experience now, and I don't mean to be blowing my trumpet here in any way, shape or form. We're very fortunate in what we've been able to do so far. But I know up there in the country, I can go outside in the evening and look at the stars and hear nothing. You know, I watch quite a bit of YouTube on country living, and this is one of the beautiful benefits of living in the country. Fresh air. I can hear the sound of the traffic. I can hear Brad when he drives by and blows his horn. But the thing is that you've got a place there of solitude, somewhat remote, and it's got to be healthier. You're away from the fumes and the noise and the hustle and bustle of city life. and not to mention anything about the moral degradation of modern society. You know, the impact that has on ourselves and our children. I mean, sure, the internet is a terrible curse upon society in many ways, because it frees up access to anything that beyond what we could even imagine as Christians. But the country life gives you a healthier, happier, more natural quality of life. Point. Yes, Brad? Sold. Okay, well, you can go into partnership with our next new property if you like. The third point, it's for our family's sake. If you've got young children, or not so young children, think of what this could mean for them and their future. You're homeschooling, away from the various negative influences of life, either in the schoolyard or just too much time on their hands and just watching their devices. Country farm life, it gives them the opportunity to be involved in something worthwhile and productive. Teach them skills, how to operate a small machine, how to dig. I saw we were doing a project up at Stewart's Point about 3 or 4 weeks ago, just when this crisis was sending us all into our homes. And a lady there wanted some photographs of her digging, because we were doing this manual labour job. And I watched her trying to operate a small shovel, a spade. And I thought, she hasn't got one clue on how to operate a shovel. Now, I wasn't meaning to be hard on her, but it just shocked me. Here's a mature woman of probably 60 or 55 years of age. She looked like an absolute, completely useless in how to use a shovel. But how do you get to that age without knowing how to use a shovel successfully? But, I mean, this is where we are letting down our children. If we're not, I can just imagine Dwayne out the backyard with his kids digging in the garden, I mean, he may not be teaching them how to use the chainsaw yet, but it may not be far down the track. And I remember when I was a child, my cousin used to have to chop the wood with an axe. He was a 7, 8, 9-year-old boy, and I used to watch him. This was terrifying, the idea of swinging that axe around, chopping wood. There's chips flying everywhere, and he didn't hesitate. He was already skilled as a young boy in how to chop wood with an axe. And I thought, wow, it just used to scare me. And even now, axes and chainsaws still scare me, and probably a good thing. But nonetheless, here's the opportunity to impart skills and lifestyle means for our children and our spouses, and maybe our extended families. And so there's a great benefit available for our family if we can make the decision, if we can move in this direction. Now, of course, I must say, not everybody can do it. It's not feasible for everybody. I think I said at the beginning that stage 1 was to go to Kalungaluk. Stage 2 may be going to a nursing home, because we don't know the future. We don't know what our health is going to be like. We don't know how long things will be delayed. But I'm hoping that it will be into the country further. Another point D, satisfaction of being self-sufficient. One of the YouTube channels I watch is a fellow calls himself Self-Sufficient Me. He's in South Queensland, and his basic motto is, you may not be able to be self-sufficient in everything, but at least be self-sufficient in something. You've got to take that first step. Now, it might be vegetables, it might be fruit trees, it might be chickens and quails or whatever else that you might want to grow in that regard. It may be, honeybees. You might have a whole heap of hives and be able to produce and even make some money out of selling it. But the satisfaction that comes with being self-sufficient, I have never experienced it, but I long for that. I'd love to be able to grow a crop of something or other that I can not only eat, but preserve and keep it throughout the next winter perhaps. Those are the sort of things that really excite me. And I have a long way to go. Whether we end up going further or staying, we'll see. And point E, God told us to do it. Why should we be considering country living now? God has told us to do it. When you see these things taking place, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee. And I, for one, don't want to be amongst that chaotic rabble of people fleeing when it's too late. You can't sell your property. You can't even buy a tank of fuel to get out to the country and escape. You'll be on foot, heading over the hills here. So God has told us to do it. And finally, God has designed us for country living. You think back to the Garden of Eden, look what they were surrounded by. A perfect place, and they were given the task of training and caring for the garden. And we talked about this in Sabbath school this morning. The book of nature has such a powerful impact in softening and subduing our hearts and teaching us things about God. You know, the lover of beauty and the intricacy that God has been able to instill within the created world in human form and many other respects. So that's basically the concept of why we should be considering country living now. Another thing that I find is very, just in a very nutshell, the idea of the New Start acronym. You know, nutrition, exercise, water, sunshine, temperance, fresh air, rest and trust in divine power. Those 8 principles, you will find them much more readily available in country living than what you'll find here in the city. You know, I've got a friend who lives in Glebe, and every time I speak with him over the last few weeks, he's complaining about the joggers out there breathing their fumes everywhere, right? Because they're indifferent to people trying to keep, you know, secure from this virus. And he said they're spluttering and blowing and coughing, and it's just like, he said he hates going out in the open air because he's living in the city. Out in the country, I bump into 1 or 2 neighbours on my daily walks, but I'm hardly any closer than Brad or I are, you know, 10 metres away from each other, 5 metres away from each other. You know, you've got fresh air, you've got, you know, the natural sunlight, you've got all the benefits of the New Start principles that we advocate. And so there's another set of good reasons there that we will benefit from as we consider this move. Now, I want to just wrap up with these final points. I'll just put them all up together. There's 5 or 6 points. How to know God's will in a matter such as this. The first and most important thing is that we must have a willingness to do what God wants us to do. If we're unwilling to go, there's no point learning about it. If we're determined to stay here, there's no point investigating and praying and searching and looking at the real estate prices and when can I go and where can I go. If you're not willing to do it, you might as well just give up on it and just stay here and hope for the best. And of course, some people will be called upon by God to stay here in the cities and give an answer for their faith. This is what I'm suggesting here is certainly not for everybody, but it may be for you. So just please think about that. Secondly, if you want to know God's will, you come to God's word. You find out from God's word what he says about certain things. You know, thy word is a light unto my path and a lamp unto my feet. And so we can come to God's word and find out just exactly, and by the way, I mean, on that point, on this particular subject, you could come to a little booklet called Country Living by Ellen White that will give you a mountain of information that you'll find helpful as to how and why you might be able to accomplish this. Thirdly, we need to look for God's providence. I've got to tell you a short story. We were looking at land up at a place called Wootton, up near Bulladila. And before we left home that morning to drive up to look, we prayed and we said to God, can you show us some kind of a sign as to whether or not you would like us to buy this property? And so I posted this on Facebook saying, we've prayed this morning, we're asking God for a sign. We went and looked at the property. We were sort of ambivalent, but when we came back down the street to the T intersection, and by the way, the name of that road was Newman's Road. I thought that's ironic too. I'm a new man in God, and this is Newman's Road. I thought, yeah, there's the sign I'm looking for, you know. But when we came out of that road, I saw the street sign, Newman's Road. There it was, and you know what? What was on top of that sign were 3 flags, 1 Australian flag and 2 Korean flags. Now, I live at home with 2 Korean ladies, Sarah and Sue, and myself. I thought there's an Australian flag for me and 1 each for Sarah and Sue. This is God's sign. It's on the signpost. God has given us a sign. He wants us to buy this property on Newman's Road. And I was thoroughly convinced, but my wife's going, no, I don't think so. So we asked for a sign. And so anyway, my point is that we need to be, and I'm not saying we did the wrong thing by not buying it, but we need to be open to God's providential leading. You know, the next thing I think is, one of the next points is prayer. We need to ask, we need to pray to God and ask him to show us the way forward and provide some providential leading. And we need to be patient. You know, sometimes we get all excited, like this is my wife and I at the moment. We're so excited about this particular property that we're ready to head for the hills. We really are. I mean, it's that exciting for us. But we need to just slow it down, take it easy, let God have a chance to provide some kind of providential leading, and just trust him to know the way forward. If he wants us to have that property, he'll make sure we can get it. If not, well, we just trust him. And so be patient and be prayerful. You know, God says in James that he will give us wisdom. And then we need to seek out wise counsellors. Now, that may not be me, it may not be your parents, it may not be your church pastor, it may be, but it needs to be someone you trust to have wise, godly judgment on matters such as these sorts of things. People who have got experience. You don't go talking to your juniors and asking for their final advice on what to do with your life, but seek godly advice from people you know you can trust. And then finally, we need to seek Jesus. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And so whatever we're doing with our lives in this modern, strange times in which we live, seeking Jesus needs to be at the forefront of it all, isn't it? You know, if we want to walk with Jesus, we need to seek him daily. We need to have a real, genuine walk with God. And knowing that Jesus is leading us the way forward, we can have confidence that this is what he wants us to do. Now, somebody said to me the other day that, well, we've got work to do. We have missionary work to do. We can't leave. Well, I said, well, you know, I'm not telling you what to do, but this is something that you can explore. There are other ways of being a missionary, whether that be in the city that you live in at the moment, or whether it be visiting the country villages around about where you go into the country, your neighbourhood, whatever. The point is that are we willing to go where God leads us when he does open a door? Are we willing to go through that?